On June 8, 1944, at 2:47 in the afternoon, a young German soldier named Oberreit Hans Müller peered through a porthole in the cargo hold of a Liberty ship. The Atlantic crossing was nearly over. Through the mist, he could make out the American shoreline. He was 23 years old. Until 3 days after D-Day, he'd been a tank gunner in North Africa. That's where the Allies had grabbed him in Normandy. For 2 solid years, Müller had made his bed on top of his panzer tank in the scorching North African desert, then later in the cold, wet foxholes of France. His diet? Captured British rations and thin vegetable soup, whatever the Wehrmacht could scrounge up. Over the past 11 months, he'd dropped 34 pounds. The German prisoners crammed into that hold weren't talking much. They'd all heard the rumors about American POW camps. Some figured they'd face execution. Others expected labor camps up in Alaska or mine-clearing duty. Müller, he'd stopped believing anything unless he could physically see it or touch it. What Müller had no way of knowing was this. In less than 3 weeks, he'd be planted at a Minnesota farmhouse table, cutting into roast chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy on the side. He'd be riding home to Stuttgart, telling his family that being a prisoner felt more like a hotel stay. And he'd be asking himself why he'd wasted 2 years fighting when he could have just surrendered back in 1942 and skipped the whole mess. The ship pulled into New York Harbor on June 11th. Müller and 847 other German POWs got processed at Ellis Island. American MPs went through the whole routine, searching them, taking photos, handing out uniforms. These uniforms were olive drab with big white PW letters stenciled across the back. Müller's was clean. Brand new. No holes, no patches. He hadn't worn anything clean in half a year. The whole processing deal took 4 hours. During that stretch, they fed the prisoners twice. Actual meat sandwiches. Coffee with real sugar in it. Müller ate carefully, half expecting someone to snatch the food away before he could finish. Nobody did. An MP even brought him a second sandwich without him asking. That same night, Müller and 400 other POWs climbed aboard a train headed west. This was a passenger train, actual seats, windows that opened. Müller had expected boxcars, like the ones Germans used for Soviet prisoners. But the Americans, passenger trains. The seats had cushions, windows you could crack open for air. An American guard walked down the aisle passing out blankets. Müller took his blanket and just stared at it for a minute. Thick wool, no lice. He wrapped it around his shoulders and fell asleep sitting straight up in his seat. 16 hours later, the train stopped in Chicago and woke him up. Guards came through distributing breakfast: bread, butter, jam, coffee. Real coffee, not that chicory garbage the Wehrmacht had been serving since 1943. Across from Müller sat a prisoner named Schmidt, former Luftwaffe mechanic. Schmidt started cracking up. He explained in German that if the Americans fed them this well just during transport, the camps probably had actual beds and working toilets. Another prisoner, Hoffman, wasn't buying it. He figured this was all propaganda. The Americans were fattening them up for Red Cross photos. Once the inspections wrapped up, they'd slash the rations. Müller kept his mouth shut. He ate his bread and butter and watched the American countryside roll past the window. Minnesota showed up on June 14th. Trucks hauled Müller and the others to a camp outside a town called Algona in north-central Minnesota. Before the war, this place had been a civilian conservation corps facility. 20 wooden barracks lined up in rows. A mess hall, recreation building, small hospital. A single strand of barbed wire fence wrapped around the whole thing with guard towers posted at the corners. Müller had pictured concrete walls and machine gun nests. This fence looked like something you'd use to keep cattle from wandering off, not to hold men. The camp commandant, U.S. Army Major, named Patterson, addressed everyone in the parade ground. Patterson spoke English. A German-speaking sergeant translated everything. Patterson laid out the Geneva Convention rules. POWs would work 6 days a week. They'd get paid at 10 cents an hour in camp scrip, 1 day off weekly, housing in barracks with beds and bedding. 3 square meals daily, access to medical care, recreation facilities, and religious services. Patterson wrapped up his speech and dismissed them. Müller walked to his assigned barracks and found a steel frame bed, mattress, 2 blankets, a pillow. He sat down and pressed the mattress. It actually compressed under his weight. A real mattress, not straw, not bare boards. Müller stretched out fully clothed and stared at the ceiling. Schmidt, assigned to the next bed over, was laughing again. He said this beat what he'd had in the Luftwaffe barracks back in Bremen. Müller agreed but didn't laugh. First meal at camp got served at 6 that evening. Müller joined the line of prisoners filing into the mess hall. American cooks dished out food from behind a counter. Müller got a tray loaded with roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, butter, and coffee, plus a slice of apple pie. He carried his tray to a table and sat down. Looking at all that food, he did the math in his head. British Army rations he'd captured in North Africa ran about 2,800 calories a day for frontline troops. The Wehrmacht ration in France, during 1944, had been cut to roughly 2,200 calories daily, and that was on paper. Actual distribution came closer to 1,600 because supply lines kept getting hit. The meal sitting on Müller's tray? About 1,400 calories. One single meal. The Americans were feeding prisoners more in one sitting than the Wehrmacht had provided all day. Müller ate slowly. He'd learned in North Africa that gobbling food after long-term hunger triggered stomach cramps. Other prisoners were scarfing it down. Some went back for seconds. The American cooks didn't stop them. Schmidt came back to the table carrying a second helping of roast beef. He sat down and explained that the cook had actually asked if he wanted more. Schmidt said yes, and the guy just filled his plate. No questions. No paperwork. Just more food. Hoffman was crying, not sobbing. Just tears streaming down his face while he ate his mashed potatoes. Müller got it. Hoffman had been grabbed at Tunis back in May of 1943. 13 months as a prisoner. First in North Africa, then in transit, now here. 13 months of not knowing if each day was his last. Eating whatever the guards felt like giving him. And now here he was, eating apple pie in Minnesota. The contrast hit hard. Work assignments kicked off the next morning. A whistle blew at 5:30. Müller got dressed and headed to the mess hall for breakfast. Pancakes, syrup, bacon, coffee. After eating, the prisoners gathered in the parade ground. American guards read work assignments off clipboards. Müller and 47 others got assigned to a vegetable farm 12 miles east of camp. They boarded a truck at 7 and rolled up to the farm at 7:43. The farm belonged to a family called Peterson. Mr. Peterson was 54. Both his sons were out in the Pacific serving with the Marines. His spread covered 640 acres. Before the war started, he'd had 6 full-time workers plus seasonal help at harvest time. Now he had his wife, his 16-year-old daughter, and German POWs. Peterson met the truck when it arrived. He talked to the American guard in charge, then addressed the prisoners in English. The translator repeated everything in German. Peterson needed the prisoners to hoe weeds in his cabbage field, 40-acre field. Quota was 3 acres per man per day. Work would continue until they finished the whole field roughly 3 weeks. Peterson would provide water and a lunch break at noon. He expected efficient work, but he didn't want anyone getting hurt. Injured workers were useless to him. Peterson walked back to his farmhouse. The guard told the prisoners to get moving. Müller had never done farm work before. Back in Stuttgart before the war, he'd been a machinist's apprentice. But hoeing weeds didn't require special skills, just the ability to keep going. He grabbed a hoe from the truck and walked into the cabbage field. The Minnesota sun was already beating down. By 9 in the morning, Müller had stripped off his shirt and was working in his undershirt. The soil was dark and rich, nothing like the sand and rocks of North Africa. The cabbages grew in straight rows. Weeds sprouted between them. Müller worked his way down one row chopping weeds, then moved to the next. At 10:15, Mrs. Peterson appeared at the field's edge carrying a big metal can. She called out in English. The guard translated, "Water break." The prisoners stopped working and walked over. Mrs. Peterson poured water into tin cups. The water was ice cold, pulled straight from a well. Müller drank 2 cups and got back to work. Noon hit, and the whistle blew again. Lunch break. The prisoners walked to the shade under a massive oak tree near the farmhouse. Mrs. Peterson and her daughter brought out baskets packed with sandwiches, ham and cheese on thick bread slices, plus apples and cookies. The prisoners sat in the shade and ate. Schmidt mentioned that lunch was better than anything he'd eaten during his entire stint in the Luftwaffe. Hoffmann agreed. Another prisoner, former infantryman named Weiss, explained how the Wehrmacht had requisitioned his family's farm in Bavaria back in 1942. The army took all their livestock and most of the grain. His parents survived on potatoes and cabbage for 2 years. And now, here he was in Minnesota, eating ham sandwiches while working a farm that had more food than his entire village had seen since 1939. Weiss finished his sandwich and lay back in the grass. He closed his eyes and said this was insane. Müller kept quiet. He ate his sandwich and watched Mrs. Peterson and her daughter head back to the farmhouse. Work continued through the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, Müller had knocked out his 3-acre quota. So had most of the others. Some had finished 4 acres. The guard checked the field and confirmed everything looked good. The prisoners loaded the hose into the truck and climbed aboard. They got back to camp at 5:17. Dinner went out at 6. Pork chops, baked potatoes, corn, bread, butter, and chocolate cake. Müller ate his meal and ran the numbers again. In 1 day, he'd consumed more calories than he typically ate in 3 days during those final months in Normandy. His body was responding. He could feel strength coming back. His hands were sore from the hoe, but that would pass. The food was making a real difference. That night, Müller wrote a letter to his parents in Stuttgart. The camp provided stationery and stamps. The Red Cross would inspect the letters and forward them through neutral channels. Müller wrote carefully. He explained his capture in Normandy and the transport to America. He was in Minnesota now, working on a farm, healthy, eating 3 meals a day. He asked about his younger brother, Klaus, who'd been drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1943 and shipped to the Eastern Front. Müller hadn't heard anything about Klaus since April. He sealed the letter and handed it to the camp's censor. The letter would take roughly 6 weeks to reach Stuttgart, assuming the postal system still functioned and his parents' house hadn't been destroyed by Allied bombing. Work on the Peterson farm ran for 3 weeks. Every day followed the same pattern. Wake at 5:30. Breakfast, truck ride to the farm, work until 4, back to camp, dinner, evening recreation. The routine was boring but predictable. Müller preferred predictable. Predictable meant no artillery barrages, no air raids, no sudden orders to retreat under fire. On June 23rd, the cabbage field was done. Peterson inspected the work and declared it satisfactory. He shook hands with the American guard and thanked him. The guard translated the thanks to the prisoners. Müller and the others got reassigned to a different farm the following week. By mid-July, Müller had packed on 11 pounds. His uniform was getting tight across his chest and shoulders. Other prisoners showed similar changes. Schmidt had gained 15 pounds. Hoffmann had gained 18. The American camp doctor ran weekly health inspections. He measured weight and checked for signs of malnutrition or disease. The doctor's report showed that the average German POW at the Algona camp had gained 12 pounds in the first 6 weeks of captivity. The doctor credited adequate nutrition and reduced stress. Müller credited eating 3 meals daily and not getting bombed or shot at. August rolled around, and Müller got reassigned to a canning factory in the town of Wells, 63 miles south of camp. The factory processed corn and peas. Indoor work way better than field work during the hottest summer weeks. Müller operated a machine that sorted peas by size, loud and repetitive, but the factory had air conditioning. Müller had never worked in an air-conditioned building before. Inside temp stayed at 68 degrees, while outside it hit 91. During lunch breaks, Müller and the other prisoners sat in the factory cafeteria eating sandwiches provided by factory management. The factory paid prisoners the standard rate of 10 cents per hour in camp scrip. Müller accumulated scrip coupons and spent them at the camp store. The camp store sold cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing paper, and beer. Beer. American prisoners of war could buy beer. Müller bought 2 bottles weekly and sipped them slowly in the barracks while writing letters home. September brought a letter from his mother, the first communication since his capture, written in July and routed through the Red Cross. His mother explained that Stuttgart had taken heavy bombing in March. Their house was damaged, but still standing. His father was working in a munitions factory. Klaus was alive. He'd been wounded in Belarus in June, but recovered and got sent back to his unit. Müller's mother asked about his health and treatment. She'd heard rumors about American POW camps. Some rumors said the Americans starved their prisoners. Other rumors claimed the Americans executed captured SS officers. Müller's mother wanted the truth. Müller wrote back immediately. He laid out his daily routine, the meals, work assignments, living conditions. He told her he'd gained weight and was healthy. The Americans treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. He was safe. He didn't tell her he was eating better food in Minnesota than he'd eaten during his entire time in the Wehrmacht. That detail felt cruel when his family was surviving on rationed food in a bombed-out city. The canning factory work continued through October. By November, harvest season was winding down. The prisoners got reassigned to logging operations in northern Minnesota. The logging camps were temporary setups in the woods. The prisoners lived in heated barracks and cut timber for the war effort. Hard work felling trees, cutting logs, loading trucks. Müller had built up strength from 5 months of farm work, but logging used different muscles. His back and arms ached after the first week. The food at the logging camp was different too. More meat, more potatoes, more bread. The cooks explained that men doing heavy labor needed extra calories. Müller's daily intake jumped to about 4,500 calories. He kept gaining weight. By December, he weighed 187.29 pounds more than when he'd arrived in June. On December 19th, Müller got another letter from his mother. Klaus was dead, killed in East Prussia during the Soviet offensive in October. His body hadn't been recovered. The Wehrmacht had sent a telegram to his parents on November 3rd. Müller read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and stuck it in his footlocker. He walked outside into the snow and stood there for several minutes. Schmidt found him and asked if he was all right. Müller explained about Klaus. Schmidt offered condolences. Müller thanked him and went back inside. That night, Müller lay in bed thinking about the mathematics of war. Klaus had fought for 2 years on the Eastern Front, survived winter, mud, Soviet artillery, 34 tanks, Katyusha rockets, and everything else the Red Army threw at him. Then he died in October 1944 while Müller was cutting timber in Minnesota and eating 4,500 calories a day. The unfairness was crushing. Logging work continued through winter. Minnesota winters were brutal. Temps dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit in January. The prisoners wore heavy coats, gloves, hats. Wood stoves heated the barracks. Prisoners took shifts feeding the stoves overnight to keep the buildings warm. Müller volunteered for night shifts. He couldn't sleep anyway. He spent those hours feeding logs into the stove and thinking about Klaus, about Stuttgart, about what would happen when the war ended. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The camp loudspeakers announced it at 3:17 in the afternoon. Müller was working in the logging camp when he heard. The American guards didn't celebrate loudly. They simply informed the prisoners that the war in Europe was over. Japan was still fighting. The prisoners would continue their work assignments until further notice. That night, camp served a normal dinner. No special meal, no speeches, just the regular evening routine. Müller sat in the mess hall eating his dinner and wondering what came next. The answer came gradually. In June, authorities announced that German POWs would remain in America until transportation could be arranged. The military needed ships to bring American soldiers home from Europe. German prisoners would have to wait. In July, camp authorities announced new regulations. No more beer or cigarettes sold in the camp store, no more soda. Meals would be adjusted to reduce costs. The food would still meet Geneva Convention requirements, but it would be less generous. American civilians had been complaining. They were dealing with rationed food while German prisoners ate roast chicken and ice cream. The complaints had reached Congress. Adjustments were necessary. Meal changes started in August. Müller noticed right away. Less meat, more potatoes. Organ meats appeared on the menu. Hearts, liver, kidneys, cuts, Americans generally avoided. The bread was darker, made with less refined flour. Desserts disappeared. The meals were still adequate, still more than Müller had eaten in the Wehrmacht, but the abundance was gone. Schmidt complained that the Americans were finally treating them like actual prisoners instead of guests. Müller disagreed. The Americans still fed them regularly, still housed them properly, still paid them for work. The reduction in food quality was minor compared to what German prisoners experienced in Soviet camps. Müller had heard stories from prisoners who'd been captured on the Eastern Front and later transferred to American custody through prisoner exchanges. Those men described Soviet camps where prisoners died by the thousands from starvation, disease, and execution. Getting captured by the Americans or British was luck. Getting captured by the Soviets was a death sentence. Work assignments continued through fall. Müller got sent back to the Peterson farm to help with harvest. Mr. Peterson greeted him by name. Müller had worked on the Peterson farm for 3 weeks back in June 1944. Now it was September 1945, and Peterson remembered him. Peterson asked about Müller's plans after repatriation. Müller explained he had no plans. Stuttgart had been bombed repeatedly. His family's home was damaged. Germany was occupied by Allied forces. The economy was destroyed. Jobs would be scarce. Müller didn't know what he'd do when he returned. Peterson nodded and said he understood. He mentioned that Minnesota would need workers after the war. If Müller wanted to stay in America, Peterson would help him navigate the immigration process. Müller thanked him but didn't commit to anything. The idea of staying in America seemed impossible. In January 1946, Müller received a letter from his father. Stuttgart was slowly recovering. The rubble was being cleared. Food was still scarce, but the Americans were providing rations. The currency was unstable, jobs were hard to find. His father suggested that if Müller had opportunities in America, he should consider staying. Germany would take years to rebuild, maybe decades. A young man with skills and ambition could do better in America than in the ruins of Stuttgart. Müller read the letter 3 times. His father was giving him permission to not come home. In February, Müller spoke with Mr. Peterson again. Peterson had already helped 2 other German POWs from the camp apply for work permits and eventual citizenship. The process was complicated, but possible. Müller would need employment sponsorship, character references, and approval from immigration authorities. Peterson could provide the employment sponsorship. The camp commandant could provide character references based on Müller's work record. Müller asked for time to think about it. Peterson said to take all the time he needed. Müller spent 2 weeks weighing the decision. Stay in America or return to Germany. Build a new life in Minnesota or rebuild the old life in Stuttgart. The mathematics were clear. America offered better opportunities. But mathematics weren't everything. Müller had family in Stuttgart. He had a history there. Could he abandon all of that to become American? Could a former Wehrmacht soldier become an American citizen? On March 3, 1946, Müller made his decision. He approached Mr. Peterson and accepted the offer. He would stay in America, apply for immigration, work on the Peterson farm and learn American farming methods and build a life in Minnesota. Peterson shook his hand and said he'd made the right choice. Müller wasn't certain about that, but he was certain about the alternative. Returning to Stuttgart meant returning to destruction, scarcity, and memories of everything that had been lost. Staying in Minnesota meant starting over. The immigration application process took 7 months. Müller was released from POW status in May 1946, but remained in the United States on a temporary work permit while his application got processed. He lived in a small apartment in Algona and worked full-time on the Peterson farm. The work was familiar by now. Peterson paid him standard agricultural wages, 35 cents per hour. Müller saved most of his earnings. He bought English grammar books and studied every evening. He practiced English with Mrs. Peterson and her daughter. By October, Müller could hold simple conversations in English without a translator. On December 17, 1946, Müller received notification that his immigration application had been approved. He would be granted permanent residency with a pathway to citizenship after 5 years. Müller read the letter 3 times. He was now a legal immigrant to the United States. A former enemy soldier who had fought against American forces in North Africa and France was now authorized to live and work in America permanently. 3 years earlier, Müller had been shooting at American soldiers from a tank in Tunisia. Now he was living in Minnesota and working on an American farm and planning to become an American citizen. Müller continued working for Peterson through 1947 and 1948. He learned American farming techniques, saved money, and improved his English. In 1949, Peterson helped him purchase 80 acres of land adjacent to the Peterson farm. Müller used his savings for the down payment and took out a loan from a local bank for the remainder. He planted corn and soybeans. The first year was rough, but he learned. By 1950, his farm was profitable. He met a woman named Margaret Hansen at church. Margaret's family had immigrated from Norway in 1923. Müller and Margaret got married in June 1951. They had 3 children over the next 5 years. On April 12, 1952, Müller became an American citizen. The ceremony took place at the federal courthouse in Fort Dodge, Iowa. Müller raised his right hand and recited the oath of allegiance. He swore to support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The judge asked him to state his name. Müller responded in English, clearly, without enough accent that anyone would notice. Hans Müller. The judge smiled and said, "Welcome home, Mr. Müller." Müller walked out of the courthouse into the April sunshine, holding his naturalization certificate. He sat in his truck in the parking lot and stared at the document. Citizen of the United States of America. He thought about Klaus, who had died in a frozen field in East Prussia. He thought about his parents in Stuttgart rebuilding their lives in a divided country. He thought about the route his life had taken, tank gunner to prisoner to farmer to American. The mathematics of it seemed impossible. Alone in the truck, Müller began to cry. Not from sadness, from relief, from gratitude. From the overwhelming weight of a second chance he'd never expected and didn't fully understand how he'd received. That evening, Müller wrote a letter to his father in Stuttgart. He explained the citizenship ceremony. He described the judge's words. He tried to put into words what it felt like to become American, to take an oath to a country that 7 years earlier he'd been fighting against. He wrote that he understood if his father was disappointed, if his mother felt he'd abandoned them, if people in Stuttgart would consider him a traitor. But he also wrote that America had given him something Germany could not. Not just food or land or opportunity, though all those things mattered. America had given him the chance to be something other than what the war had made him. In Germany, he would always be a soldier who'd lost. In America, he could be a farmer, a husband, eventually a father. The war had taken Klaus and millions of others. It had destroyed cities and families and entire ways of life. But somehow, impossibly, it had also brought Müller to Minnesota, to the Peterson farm, to this moment in a courthouse in Iowa where a judge called him an American and told him, "Welcome home." Müller sealed the letter and walked to the post office. He mailed it to Stuttgart and drove back to his farm. Margaret was waiting on the porch. She asked how the ceremony went. Müller showed her the certificate. She hugged him and said she was proud. That night they celebrated with a quiet dinner. Just the two of them, and the life they were building together in a country that had once been the enemy and was now home. Hans Müller farmed in Minnesota for 43 years. He raised 3 children who became teachers, engineers, and nurses. He never returned to Germany. His parents died in the 1960s. He maintained correspondence with relatives in Stuttgart until his own death, but Minnesota was where he belonged. The farm he bought in 1949 stayed in the family. When Müller died in February 2011 at age 89, his funeral was held at the same Lutheran church where he'd married Margaret 60 years earlier. Over 200 people attended, former students from the high school where he'd spoken about his POW experience, neighbors whose families had known him for decades, his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The pastor noted in his eulogy that Müller had fought in a terrible war, had been captured by the enemy, and had somehow found not punishment or revenge, but mercy. The pastor said that Müller's life proved that even in humanity's darkest moments, grace was possible, that former enemies could become neighbors, that a man could leave everything behind and build something new, that America at its best was a place where second chances were real. If this story hit you the way it hit us, do us a favor, smash that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to push this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're pulling forgotten stories out of dusty archives every single day. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Our community spans the entire globe. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Thanks for watching, and thanks for making sure Hans Müller doesn't disappear into silence.